Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this video in which we'll be going over the Supreme Court case Citizens United versus F.E.C. This is a hugely important one for the AP test. It's one of the most controversial in our country's recent history. So you'll definitely want to be well armed, well equipped with all of the information about campaign finance, about how money gets into our elections, and why that connects to the First Amendment. So we're going to dive right in and try to understand this debate a little bit more. This connects to your chapter in the textbook about elections, and the gist of it goes something like this. When you spend money, your money really does represent in a real way your voice, right? Your voice can be represented by your money. We know this. You can decide to buy or not to buy a product, to voice support for that company, for instance. So donating to a political candidate is absolutely a way of expressing your opinion, which is part of the whole reason we have the First Amendment. However, when it comes time to really look critically at elections and how they're funded, some of the biggest spenders are not people, they're corporations, they're groups, they're nonprofit entities, they're anything bigger than just you or me. And that makes sense. They have a lot of money they can pool together. And so the question really becomes, do these corporations, do these groups have those same individual rights to express their opinion through money as you or I? And that's exactly what was being tested in the case Citizens United versus the F.E.C. Remember, the F.E.C. is the Federal Election Commission. That's a bureaucratic agency responsible for regulating all of the money that goes into our country's elections. The story goes something like this. It was a 2008 election cycle, and there was a nonprofit group called Citizens United. Now, Citizens United during that year, 2008, wanted to produce and show a documentary called Hillary, the movie. This was very critical of Hillary Clinton, and they were not allowed to produce this because it had a huge budget, and also this was during an election year. So since it was so close to the election, this was considered illegal according to the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. That's a really big vocab word to get out of your textbook. Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. It was in the early 2000s. It really put a lot of limits on spending by groups, but this group wanted to produce and show a movie. And that sort of raised some questions, right? Can the government stop you from producing a movie? They weren't working with any Republican candidates. They were just trying to bash Hillary Clinton. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Citizens United that the bans on producing this movie was unconstitutional because, as Justice John Roberts would say, political speech is crucial to a democracy. Even if that speech comes from corporations or groups or labor unions or nonprofit groups like Citizens United. That political speech criticizing the right to criticize is so important. The Supreme Court has ruled for it time and time again, even in this case, in the case of a corporation, the case of not just an individual. And what this opened the door, in combination with a few other Supreme Court rulings in that cycle, was this created and protected what we call today as super PACs. Now, a PAC is a political action committee. That's when a group of people with a common goal raise and spend money to support a candidate. But a super PAC is when people can do that without having any spending limits to hit them from the F.E.C. And this is a result of Citizens United, but we'll need to go into some of the minutiae in order to really understand it. The idea goes something like this. Donations can come from a lot of places, and they can go to a lot of places. In our most traditional version of campaign finance, you, an individual, might give money to a candidate. You might give it directly to, for instance, Barack Obama or Donald Trump or Joe Biden. But this is actually, as you can see in this little chart here, only a very small fraction of political spending. Most money comes from individuals and goes somewhere else, like a political action committee, a nonprofit, a labor union, or something of that sort. And those groups can all pool their money into a few different places. They can pool their money into nonprofits like Citizen United, or they can pool their money into things called super PACs. You see, a super PAC, this was basically created by the Citizens United ruling, where they said, really, if political spending is protected by the First Amendment, that means that there are group entities that can spend an unlimited amount of money during a campaign, as long as they don't work directly with a candidate. We know that if you're going to donate to a candidate or to a political party, those have strict limits. However, if you're going to donate to a group and that group isn't going to work with the candidate or party, they're just going to spend money, well, then they don't actually have any limits. And again, we call these super PACs. Super PACs can spend an unlimited amount of money in our elections during campaign as long as they don't work directly with a candidate. And 501c4s, groups like Citizens United. Citizens United was not technically a super PAC. They can actually spend almost as much money, basically up to half of their budget, but they have to disclose their donors, right? So they have to tell who it was that donated. A super PAC actually doesn't have those same requirements. And so this is where a huge door was opened in our campaign finance system as a result of this ruling, which was on its face a very simple ruling. Chief Justice John Roberts and 4 others just saying, look, spending, political spending, even when it's by a group, is part of that freedom of speech. This whole complex web really emerges as a result of that. So what has the impact been? Well, 5 justices were in favor of this, but 4 were against it. In particular, Justice John Paul Stevens, who would be retiring shortly after this, he said, in a functioning democracy, the public must have faith that its representatives owe their positions to the people, not to the corporations with the deepest pockets. You know, this is a big concern. In the aftermath of Citizens United, a vast majority of Republicans and Democrats were opposed to the ruling. And the reason was because these groups, these super PACs that were spending unlimited amounts of money during elections, well, in theory, they weren't going to be working with candidates, but in practice, they were directly supporting one party or one side again and again and again. You know, at a time when the Democrats had the majority in the Senate, they started something called the Senate Majority PAC. It's pretty obvious if you're donating to them or if you see an ad from them, which side they're supporting. You know, and when you have things like the Right to Rise USA or the Senate Leadership Fund or the Congressional Leadership Fund that are also more Republican-leaning super PACs. And the fact of the matter is these groups have compiled tons of money and spent literally, as you can see, hundreds of millions of dollars in our elections since their creation by Citizens United. Now, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Well, it's a controversial thing is what I want to impart on you today, right? Some would say it's good because it's a more robust interpretation of the First Amendment, that the First Amendment protects your right to spend, a group's right to pool their money and spend in favor or against a candidate. Others would say this just increases the amount of money in our campaign finance system. It makes elections more expensive, harder to regulate, and both sides maybe have a point there. What might you be expected to say about Citizens United on the AP test? Well, first, you can definitely expect multiple choice questions about campaign finance and about how Citizens United struck down some of the limits from the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. But on one of those Supreme Court FRQ questions, I think there's really 2 directions they might go. The first, the Supreme Court has used the First Amendment actually in many other cases to block rules about election spending or spending in general. And secondly, as I just hinted a moment ago, when the Supreme Court rules about anything related to elections, that tends to be immensely controversial because right up there with the First Amendment and the freedom of speech, we consider our right to vote. And so when these 2 things are maybe even interacting, like in this case, well, let's just say that gets very, very controversial. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope this helps you begin to understand this case a little bit better. I hope you'll take this and look at those concepts of campaign finance and really begin to understand the key vocabulary like Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, Super PAC, PAC. And if you can get those down along with this case, you're going to be in good shape. Thanks for tuning in and have a great day.